December 1945. Upper Egypt. A farmer digging for fertilizer strikes something hard beneath the sand. It is a sealed clay jar, almost as tall as his arm is long. He hesitates. A spirit might live inside it. Gold might live inside it too. He breaks it. Inside are 13 leather-bound books, copied 16 centuries ago. Tonight, we are not going to tell you that the church burned secret gospels to hide the truth about Jesus. The record is stranger than that. In the year 397, in a port city in North Africa, a council of bishops confirmed a list of 27 books. That list was the final page of a much longer story. And the books left outside, it had started their walk into the desert long before. Why they were left out is not a mystery. The men who left them out wrote their reasons down. Tonight, we read those reasons. Where the record is certain, you will hear it plainly. Where scholars still argue, you will hear that too. The jar is open. Let us read what was inside. Chapter 1. The jar in the desert. Begin with the cliff. It is called Jabal al-Tarif, and it rises out of the Nile Valley in Upper Egypt like a wall built by something older than any kingdom. The rock is honeycombed with caves. Some are natural. Some were cut by hand more than 4,000 years ago, as tombs for men whose names have worn away. At the foot of this cliff, the ground is soft. The local farmers have known for generations that this soil, a natural fertilizer they call sabach, is worth the ride out from the villages. In December of 1945, a few months after the end of the Second World War, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman rode out to that cliff with his brothers and their camels. He came from a village called Al-Qasr, near the market town of Nag Hammadi. He was digging for fertilizer. That is all. He was not looking for history. History, as it tends to do in Egypt, was simply waiting under his feet. His mattock struck something that was not soil. What he uncovered, by his own account, was a sealed earthenware jar, almost as tall as his arm was long, with a bowl fastened over its mouth. And here the story slows down, because Muhammad Ali did something very human. He stopped. He was afraid to break the jar. In the villages of Upper Egypt, there were old stories about sealed vessels, and about the spirits called jinn that might be closed up inside them. Breaking the seal might release something that could not be put back. But there was a second possibility, and it argued with the first one inside his mind. Sealed jars sometimes held gold. Greed. As one of the scholars who later reconstructed this scene liked to observe, is a powerful cure for fear. Muhammad Ali raised his mattock and smashed the jar. Something golden did rise into the air, but it was not treasure. It was a cloud of tiny papyrus fragments, glinting in the sunlight. The dust of pages that had been sealed in darkness for roughly 1,600 years. When it settled, he was looking at 13 books bound in worn brown leather. We should pause here and be honest about this scene, because honesty is the whole point of tonight. Almost everything we know about the discovery comes from Muhammad Ali himself. Interviewed decades later by James Robinson, the American scholar from Claremont who led the effort to publish these texts in English, Robinson made several trips to Egypt in the 1970s to find the farmer and walk the ground with him. And Robinson himself noted that the details shifted a little from one telling to the next. The date, the exact spot, who was present, the broad outline is accepted by most scholars. The fine details are a farmer's memory of one strange morning. recalled across 30 years. You deserve to know that. So now you do. What is not in doubt is what the books were, because the books survived, and they have been studied, line by line, for decades. They were codices, not scrolls, but bound books with pages, one of the earliest book technologies in the world. Their pages were papyrus, their covers were leather, their language was Coptic, the final stage of the ancient Egyptian language, written mostly with Greek letters. Inside those 13 bindings were more than 50 separate works. Most were translations of texts originally composed in Greek, and most were religious. There were Gospels that never made it into any Bible. A Gospel of Thomas, a Gospel of Philip, a Gospel of Truth. There were secret books, Apocalypse, prayers, and philosophical treatises. Some of the titles alone sound like doors left ajar. The Secret Book of John, The Thunder, Perfect Mind. And one of the most remarkable things about these books is that we can date them. Not by legend, but by garbage. The leather covers were stiffened with cartonnage, which is a technical word for scrap paper. The book binders, 16 centuries ago, padded the covers with whatever used papyrus was lying around. Old letters, receipts, business accounts. When modern scholars carefully peeled those layers apart, they found dated documents from the middle of the 4th century. Some of the datable scraps come from the 340s AD, which means the books were bound after that. Most scholars place the manufacture of the codices somewhere in the second half of the 300s. Hold on to that century. Something else happened in Egypt in those exact decades, and it may explain why these books were in a jar at all. We will get there. Back at the cliff. In 1945, none of this was known. Muhammad Ali wrapped the books in his tunic, slung them over a camel, and rode home. And what happened next is the kind of detail that makes historians wake up sweating. He unloaded the books next to the oven. His mother, by the family's own account, used some of the papyrus as kindling, pages that had survived Roman emperors, desert centuries, and 1,600 years of silence were burned to start a cooking fire in a village courtyard. We do not know exactly what was lost. That is the terrible thing about burned pages. They do not leave a table of contents behind. There was also a darker complication, and it is part of the record. So we will tell it plainly. The Al-Saman family was in the middle of a blood feud. Muhammad Ali's father had been killed, and by Muhammad Ali's own account to Robinson, he and his brothers later took revenge on the man they held responsible. Fearing a police search of the house, the family did not want valuable, mysterious books sitting in it. So the codices began to scatter. Some were left with a local Coptic priest. The stories from those months say that individual volumes changed hands for almost nothing, sums that would embarrass a used bookstore. One by one they drifted toward Cairo, into the hands of antiquities dealers. The way water finds a drain. From there the books traveled like characters in a spy novel. The Egyptian government stepped in, and over the following years most of the collection was gathered into the Coptic Museum in Old Cairo, where it remains today. But one codex slipped out of the country. It crossed borders, passed through dealers, and was eventually purchased in 1952 through the efforts of the Dutch scholar Gilles Quispel and the Jung Institute in Zurich. It was presented as a gift to the famous psychiatrist Carl Jung, which is why that volume is still known as the Jung Codex. After Jung's death, its pages were returned to Cairo, and the collection was whole again, or as whole as fire and commerce had allowed it to remain. Now step back from the drama for a moment and look at what was actually sitting in that museum. 13 books, copied in the 4th century, buried. Most scholars believe on purpose, not thrown away, not burned by their owners, which would have taken one evening and left no trace. Sealed carefully in a jar, at the base of a cliff full of ancient tombs, a short walk from the ruins of one of the earliest Christian monasteries in the world, founded by a monk named Pachomius. Somebody wanted these books to survive something, and somebody succeeded. By a margin of 16 centuries and one swing of a farmer's mattock, 2 questions will carry us through the rest of the night. What is written in these books? And why did the men who were assembling the Bible, in those very same decades, read books like these and say no? The first question has an answer you can check for yourself, because the texts are translated and published. So let us open them. Chapter 2. What the books actually say. Imagine the reading room of the Coptic Museum in Old Cairo. The pages under the glass are brown at the edges, and the ink is still dark after 16 centuries. Because the desert is the best librarian on earth. The language is Coptic, the handwriting is careful. Whoever copied these books was not scribbling. They were preserving something they loved. The most famous book in the collection is the Gospel of Thomas, and the first honest thing to say about it is that it will surprise you, but not in the way you expect. There is no Christmas story in Thomas, no manga, no star, no wise men. There is also no trial, no cross, and no empty tomb. The Gospel of Thomas is not a story at all. It is a list. 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, one after another. Most of them beginning with the same plain formula. Jesus said, "It reads less like a biography and more like a notebook." As if someone had followed a teacher around for years and written down only the sentences. Some of those sentences sound almost exactly like the New Testament. Thomas has versions of the mustard seed, the sower, the blind, leading the blind. By many scholarly counts, about half of the sayings in Thomas have close parallels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and some counts run higher, but the rest is different, and the difference has a specific flavor. Listen to the opening line of the book. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. Not whoever believes. Whoever finds the interpretation, salvation, in Thomas, is a puzzle you solve. In another famous saying, the disciples ask when the kingdom will come, and the answer is that the kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth, and people do not see it. The kingdom is not an event you wait for. It is a secret hiding in plain sight, and the whole task of life is learning to see it. That one idea, that rescue comes through hidden knowledge rather than public faith, is the thread that runs through almost the entire jar. Keep your hand on that thread. Later tonight, it is precisely the thing the bishops could not accept. Now, a question historians genuinely argue about, so you should hear both sides. How old is Thomas? The Coptic copy from Nag Hammadi was made in the 300s, but scraps of Thomas in Greek were found at a site called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt decades earlier, and those scraps are dated to around the year 200. The original is older still. Some scholars, including Elaine Pagels of Princeton, have argued that parts of Thomas may reach back into the 1st century, close to the age of the New Testament Gospels themselves. Other scholars place it in the middle of the 2nd century, seeing it as dependent on the earlier Gospels. That debate is still open. Anyone who tells you it is settled is selling something. Next to Thomas, in the same codex, sits the Gospel of Philip. Philip is not a list of sayings. It is closer to a scrapbook of theology. Reflections on baptism, on anointing, on marriage as a mirror of heaven. Most scholars date its composition to the late 2nd or 3rd century, and Philip contains the single most famous damaged sentence in the entire collection. The text says that Jesus loved Mary Magdalene more than the other disciples, and that he used to kiss her often on her. And there the papyrus breaks. There is a hole in the page. The word after her is missing. Novelists filled that hole with a marriage. The manuscript does not. Scholars have pointed out that in Philip, a kiss appears elsewhere as a symbol of spiritual teaching, the passing of truth from mouth to mouth. The honest answer is that we do not know what the missing word was, and no responsible historian claims to. What we can say is that a 3rd century text imagined Mary Magdalene as a student ranked above the men around her. That idea alone was radical. Which brings us to a correction. And your narrator insists on making it, because almost every video on this subject gets it wrong. The Gospel of Mary, the famous text in which Mary Magdalene comforts the frightened disciples and reveals private teaching, was not in the Nag Hammadi jar. It was found half a century earlier. In 1896, a German scholar named Karl Reinhardt bought an ancient book in Cairo, now called the Berlin Codex, and the Gospel of Mary was inside it. It belongs to the same broad family of texts, and it is usually published alongside the Nag Hammadi library, but it came out of the ground by a different road. Small detail, but tonight is about getting the record straight. And the record starts with details. Back to the jar. Alongside the Gospels sit stranger things. There is a text called the Secret Book of John. In some translations, the Apocryphon of John, and it may be the most important book in the collection for understanding what this movement believed. It presents itself as a revelation given by the risen Jesus to the Apostle John, and it tells nothing less than the secret history of the universe. A perfect, unknowable God. A family of divine beings flowing out from that God like light from a flame. A catastrophe among those beings. And the birth of a lesser, ignorant creator who makes this world as a kind of prison. We will spend the whole next chapter inside that story, because without it, nothing about the coming conflict makes sense. For now, notice one fact. The secret book of John was found in 3 separate copies at Nag Hammadi, plus a 4th in the Berlin Codex. Whoever owned this library did not consider it a curiosity. They considered it essential. There is the Gospel of Truth, which is not a story about Jesus but a sermon, almost a poem, about ignorance and awakening. It is beautifully written, and some scholars believe its author may have been Valentinus himself, the most brilliant Christian teacher of the 2nd century to be later branded a heretic. That attribution remains a scholarly guess rather than a fact. Irenaeus, a bishop we will meet properly later tonight, mentions a gospel of truth circulating among the followers of Valentinus, which is one reason the guess exists at all. And there is a text unlike anything else in ancient literature, a poem called The Thunder, Perfect Mind, in which a female divine voice speaks in riddles made of opposites. I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the whore and the holy one. Scholars still argue about who this speaker is meant to be. The poem never says, It simply thunders. Now step back and ask what all of this amounts to. More than 50 works. Gospels without crosses. Creation stories with a villain for a creator. Poems in the voice of a goddess. Secret teachings handed to individual disciples in private. The 19th century had a word ready for material like this. And the word stuck. Gnostic. From gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge. It is worth telling you plainly that many scholars today are uneasy with that label. The people who wrote these texts mostly did not call themselves Gnostics. They called themselves Christians. The books in the jar do not even agree with each other. Some come from the school of Valentinus. Some come from a tradition scholars call Sethian. A few are not Christian at all. One is a fragment of Plato. The jar is not a rival Bible. It is a library, assembled by readers with wide and daring taste. But the texts at its core do share one burning conviction, that the world you can see is not the whole story, that something in you fell here from somewhere higher, and that a teacher came, not to die for you, but to wake you up. To understand why the bishops of the 4th century read that sentence and reached for their pens, you first have to hear the full story those texts were telling. The story of a God above God, a fallen wisdom named Sophia, and a blind creator who does not know he is not alone. Chapter 3. The God above God. Every religion has a story it tells about the beginning. To understand why the books in the jar alarmed the bishops, you have to hear the beginning those books were telling. So, settle back and listen to one of the strangest creation stories of the ancient world. Our main source is the secret book of John. The text found in 3 copies at Nag Hammadi and a 4th in Berlin. Scholars often call the tradition behind it Sethian, after Seth, the son of Adam, whom these believers claimed as their spiritual ancestor. The book presents itself as a vision given to the Apostle John after the crucifixion. When he is grieving and full of questions, the heavens open, a figure appears in shifting forms, and the voice begins to explain what is really going on. It starts with a God nothing like the God of Sunday school. The true God, in this story, is not a king on a throne. It is an infinite, perfect, unknowable depth. The text spends page after page saying what this God is not. Not limited, not in time, not even a God, properly speaking, because the word is too small. Modern readers sometimes compare the language to a mathematician trying to describe infinity. The ancient writer simply calls it the invisible spirit. From that depth, the story says, reality unfolds like light spreading from a flame. The spirit thinks, and its thought becomes a divine being. That being emanates others, wisdom, foreknowledge, life. The texts call these beings aeons, and together they form a realm of light called the pleroma, a Greek word meaning fullness. Picture a court of living ideas, arranged in perfect harmony around a source none of them can fully see. And then comes the mistake. The youngest of these divine beings is named Sophia. The word is Greek for wisdom. Sophia, the story says, wanted to create something on her own, without her partner and without the consent of the spirit. What she produced was malformed, a being unlike his mother, imperfect, blind to the world of light above him. The text gives him a name that sounds like a growl, Yaldabaoth, ashamed. Sophia casts him away, wrapping him in a cloud, hiding him from the eons. Here is the turn that changes everything. Yaldabaoth, alone in the dark, begins to create. He makes rulers and powers to serve him. He builds heavens and thrones. And then he looks at his handiwork and makes the announcement on which this entire theology pivots. He declares that he is God, and that there is no other God beside him. Any ancient Jewish or Christian listener would have flinched at that line. And the flinch was intentional. Those are the words of the God of Israel in the book of Isaiah. The secret book of John has placed the declaration of the biblical creator into the mouth of an ignorant, arrogant, lesser being who does not know his own mother exists above him. The story even has a voice called down from the heights in answer. You are wrong, Samael, which the text explains as meaning God of the blind. Let the weight of that land. In this system, the creator of our world is not the true God. He is a cosmic accident with delusions of grandeur. The material world he built is not a gift. It is a mistake. Or worse, a trap. Scholars of religion use a technical term for a creator figure of this kind, borrowed from Greek philosophy, the demiurge, from a word in Plato's dialogue, Timaeus, meaning craftsman. Plato's craftsman was good and worked from perfect models. The Gnostic demiurge is Plato's craftsman gone wrong, a builder who thinks he is the architect. But the story is not finished, because something of the light gets inside us. When Yaldabaoth and his powers create Adam, the myth says, they shape a body, but the body will not stand up. It lies there, inert. So through a trick played on the blind creator, the power that Sophia had lost is breathed into the human being, Adam rise. And now the catastrophe has a hostage. A spark of the divine fullness is locked inside human bodies, inside the demiurge's world, and the rulers of that world will do anything to keep it asleep. In this telling, the Garden of Eden is not paradise. It is sedation. The tree of knowledge is not the fall of man. It is the first alarm bell. The serpent, in some of these texts, is not the villain. It is the first messenger of the truth. You can feel, just from the shape of the story, why no compromise was ever going to be possible with the emerging church. This is not a variation on the biblical story. It is the biblical story turned inside out, with the signs on heaven and earth deliberately reversed. And it explains what these believers thought a savior actually was. If the problem is a sleeping spark, the solution is not a sacrifice. It is a wake-up call. Christ, in this system, descends from the true God, slips past the rulers of the lower heavens, and comes to remind the sparks what they are and where they came from. Salvation is memory. It is knowledge. It is gnosis. That is why the Gospel of Thomas promises life to whoever finds the interpretation of the sayings. That is why these communities treasured secret teaching. In their eyes, faith was for beginners, knowledge was for the saved. Some of these texts push the logic one step further, into the claim that would scandalize the bishops more than any other. If the material world is a prison, did the Savior truly take on flesh? Several texts in this broad family suggest he only appeared to. Some describe the crucifixion as a kind of illusion, with the true Christ untouched above it. And at least one text found at Nag Hammadi speaks of him laughing at those who thought they could kill him. The technical name for this idea is docetism, from a Greek word meaning to seem. Hold on to it. When we read the bishop's actual objections, docetism is near the top of the list. Now, Honesty requires 3 footnotes to this whole picture. Here they are, spoken plainly. First, not every text in the jar tells this exact story. The school of Valentinus, the movement's most sophisticated branch, softened the myth considerably. In Valentinian teaching, as reconstructed by scholars like Elaine Pagels, the creator is more ignorant than evil, and the story reads more like a psychological drama about how minds fall into forgetfulness. The Sethian texts and the Valentinian texts disagree with each other, sometimes sharply. Second, most of what earlier generations knew about these believers came from their enemies. Writers like Irenaeus of Lyon, who quoted them in order to refute them. For centuries, historians had only the prosecution's case file. The jar at Nag Hammadi finally let the defense speak, and one of the discoveries was that the enemies had quoted them, on the whole, more accurately than anyone expected, though with all the sympathy removed. Third, scholars genuinely argue about where this movement came from. Some see it growing out of Jewish speculation about angels and creation. Some see Greek philosophy in Christian dress. Some, like the 20th century scholar Hans Jonas, read it as something close to an ancient existentialism, a cry of alienation from the world itself. The debate is alive, and we will not pretend to settle it tonight. But whatever its origin, notice what this faith demanded. It asked its followers to believe that the world was a mistake, that its maker was a fraud. That scripture read forward was scripture read wrong, and that rescue belonged to the few who could grasp a secret. Against that stood another vision, slowly organizing itself around bishops and public creeds, insisting that creation was good, that God was one, and that salvation was announced in daylight to anyone who would hear it. 2 visions, 1 name, Christian, claimed by both. Something was going to have to give, and the first thing that gave, strangely enough, was the bookshelf. Chapter 4. A church without a Bible. Picture a dining room in the city of Corinth. Around the year 100, the lamps are lit. Perhaps 20 people have crowded in after dark, because most of them worked through the daylight. A dockworker still smelling of tar, a wool merchant's widow, 2 enslaved men from the same household, sitting beside a city official who, outside this room, would never share their bench. The host is the only one wealthy enough to own the house. When the noise settles, a reader stands, unrolls a scroll, and begins. The scroll is not the New Testament. There is no New Testament, not because it was forbidden, because it did not exist yet, not as a book, not as a list, not as a settled thing with a front cover and a back cover and nothing to argue about in between. That absence is the single most surprising fact in tonight's story, and everything at Carthage flows from it. So stay in this room a moment longer and look at what these people actually had. The scripture being read aloud is what we now call the Old Testament, usually in its Greek translation, the Septuagint, the Psalms, the prophets, Isaiah, above all. That was the Bible of the first Christians, and for a long time it was the only book they meant when they said the word scripture. So, where was Jesus in all this? He was in the room, but not yet on the shelf. He lived in spoken memory, stories told by people who had heard them from people who had heard him. Historians call this the oral tradition, and we have a remarkable witness to how much it was treasured. A bishop named Papias, writing in the early 2nd century, said plainly that he preferred the living voice to books. When travelers came through his city, he would ask them what the disciples had actually said, hunting memories the way we might hunt rare recordings. His own writings survive only in fragments quoted by the later historian Eusebius, which is its own quiet lesson about how easily books vanish. Alongside the spoken stories, documents were beginning to circulate, and the earliest of them were not Gospels. They were mail, the letters of Paul, written in the 50s of the first century to specific congregations with specific problems, were copied and passed from city to city. They were practical, argumentative, sometimes angry, and never written with the faintest idea that they were scripture. Paul was solving crises, not composing a Bible. Yet within a couple of generations, something had shifted. A letter that made it into the New Testament under the name of Peter refers to the letters of Paul and, in the same breath, compares them to the other scriptures. Somewhere in those decades, in other words, Christian writings had started to climb the shelf. The Gospels came next, and they came without name tags. Most scholars date Mark to around the year 70, with Matthew and Luke following in the 80s or 90s, and John near the close of the century. Those dates are the mainstream scholarly view, not a certainty, and some researchers argue for earlier or later placements. But here is the detail that matters for our story. The earliest copies do not announce their authors in the text itself. The familiar titles, the Gospel according to Matthew and the rest, were attached as the books circulated, and the first surviving discussions of who wrote what come from the 2nd century. The Church was already having to make judgment calls about authorship within living memory of the apostles' deaths. Remember that. The question of who really wrote a book is about to become one of the sharpest tools in the whole debate. By the middle of the 2nd century, we get our first clear snapshot of Christian worship from the inside. And it is worth pausing on. A philosopher named Justin, later called Justin Martyr because of how his story ended, wrote an open defense of Christianity to the Roman emperor around the year 155. In it, he describes the Sunday gathering, the memoirs of the apostles, he says, are read aloud, along with the writings of the prophets. For as long as time allows, notice two things. The Gospels are now being read in worship, side by side with the ancient prophets, which is a promotion of enormous significance. And notice what Justin does not say. He gives no list. He does not say which memoirs, or how many, or where the line falls. The practice existed, the boundary did not, and into that open boundary flowed books, far more books than four. There was a manual called the Didache, a kind of instruction booklet for church life, with rules for baptism and fasting and how to tell a true traveling prophet from a freeloader. There was a letter from the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth, known as First Clement, written around the 90s of the 1st century. There was the Epistle of Barnabas, and there was a strange, sprawling visionary book called The Shepherd of Hermas, in which a former slave in Rome receives revelations from an angelic figure. If you have never heard of these books, that is only because of decisions made much later. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they were serious contenders. Some Christian teachers quoted the Shepherd as scripture. And here is a physical fact you can verify in a museum today. Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest complete Bibles in existence, copied in the 4th century and now held largely at the British Library, includes both the Epistle of Barnabas and the Shepherd of Hermas, bound in after Revelation. as late as the 300s. In other words, at least one community's Bible was bigger than yours. So picture the situation as the 2nd century opens. A movement spreading through the cities of the Roman world with astonishing speed. A sacred bookshelf with no bookends. Gospels circulating without settled authorship. Letters treasured in one city and unknown in the next. Books like The Shepherd rising towards Scripture, and books like the ones that would one day fill the jar at Nag Hammadi beginning to appear, each claiming its own private line back to Jesus. The Gospel of Thomas, remember, may have taken shape in exactly this period, and its readers considered themselves Christians, not outsiders, who was supposed to sort this out. There was no pope in the later sense, no Vatican, no global administration of any kind. Christianity was a network of local congregations connected by letters, travelers, and trust. Historians like Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina have spent careers mapping just how diverse this early landscape was, with different cities emphasizing different texts and different teachings, all under the same name. Some scholars think the diversity ran even deeper than the surviving sources show. Since the winners of later debates did most of the preserving, now ask yourself a practical question. The kind a congregation in the year 140 would actually face. A visitor arrives with a scroll. It is called a gospel. It says things about Jesus you have never heard before. Do you read it aloud on Sunday? By what standard do you decide? Nobody had written that standard down, because until now, nobody had been forced to. History has a way of supplying the force. It usually arrives as a person. This time the person came with money, conviction, organizational genius, and a pair of scissors. Around the year 140, a wealthy shipowner from the Black Sea coast arrived in Rome, made the largest donation the Roman Church had ever recorded, and then calmly explained that most of what Christians were reading did not belong in a Bible at all. His name was Marcion. Turn the page. Chapter 5. The Man with the Scissors. Every institution can point to a moment when someone forced it to define itself. For the Christian Bible, that someone arrived in Rome around the year 140, stepping off a ship he probably owned. His name was Marcion, and he came from Sinope, a port city on the southern coast of the Black Sea, in what is now Turkey. The ancient sources agree that he was wealthy, and they usually say he was a shipowner, a man whose fortune moved with cargo across dangerous water. Church tradition adds that his father was a bishop, though details of his early life come to us thinly and mostly from his enemies. Hold them loosely. What is beyond dispute is what he did when he reached the capital. He made an enormous donation to the Roman Church. One of our sources, the North African writer Tertullian, records the figure as 200,000 sesterces, a sum that would have marked him instantly as a major patron. And then, having bought himself a hearing, Marcion stood up and told the Christians of Rome that they had misunderstood their own religion from the beginning. His argument had a brutal simplicity, and to be fair to the man, it grew out of a problem serious readers still wrestle with today. Marcion had read the scriptures closely, and he could not reconcile the God he found in the law and the prophets with the God he found in the preaching of Jesus. One commands armies and orders judgment. The other tells you to love your enemies and forgive without limit. Ordinary Christian teachers held these together as one God revealed in stages. Marcion snapped them apart. There were, he concluded, two gods, the creator God of the Jewish scriptures, a real being, just, harsh, and limited, the maker of this difficult world, and above him, previously unknown, a God of pure mercy, an alien God who had nothing to do with creation, who sent Jesus as a rescue mission from outside. If that sounds familiar after our chapter on the Demiurge, you have been paying attention. Scholars still debate how much Marcion belongs with the Gnostics, and the current consensus, represented by historians like Bart Ehrman, tends to file him separately. He built his case on close reading rather than secret mythology, and he preached rescue by faith rather than by hidden knowledge. He had no Sophia, no Aeon, no cosmic fall, but on the central intuition that the maker of this world is not the highest God and that Jesus came from somewhere above him. Marcion and the Gnostic teachers were disturbingly close cousins. The bishops would eventually reject both, for overlapping reasons, which is exactly why he matters to our story. Because Marcion did something no Christian had ever done before. He published a list. Think about the situation from the last chapter. Gospels circulating without settled titles, letters of Paul treasured in one city, unknown in the next. Books like The Shepherd of Hermas drifting up toward Scripture. Nobody had drawn a boundary, because nobody had needed one. Marcion needed one, because his theology required surgery. If the Creator God was not the true God, then the Jewish scriptures could not be Christian scripture. He removed them entirely, the whole shelf. And from the Christian writings then in circulation, he kept exactly two things: one gospel, a version of Luke, and 10 letters of Paul. The apostle he considered the only one who had truly understood Jesus. Even that was not the end of the scissors. According to Tertullian, who wrote 5 thick books against him decades later, Marcion edited the texts he kept, trimming away passages where the Creator God was honored or the Jewish scriptures were quoted approvingly. In Marcion's account, he was restoring documents that had been corrupted by others. In his opponent's account, he was mutilating them. Modern scholars note, with appropriate caution, that we know his addition mostly through hostile quotation, and a minority of researchers have argued that in some places his text may preserve early readings. That technical debate is open. The historical headline is not, "A man had decided, alone, what belonged in the Christian book and what did not, and had published the result." The reaction in Rome was swift. In the year 144, the Church formally expelled him and, according to the traditional account, returned his money to the last coin. Remember that detail the next time someone tells you religious institutions never turn down a donation. Here is where the story stops being a biography and becomes the hinge of our entire night. Because Marcion did not slink away, he went out and built a rival church, and he was terrifyingly good at it. He organized congregations with their own bishops, their own liturgy, their own discipline, and his one gospel and 10 letters at the center. Justin Martyr, writing only about a decade later, complained that Marcion's teaching had already spread to every nation of people. Allow for rhetorical exaggeration, and it is still an astonishing statement about a movement barely 10 years old. Marcionite churches would survive for centuries. As late as the year 200, in some regions of the East, a traveler might reasonably have wondered which brand of Christianity was winning. Now, put yourself in the sandals of an ordinary bishop in, say, Smyrna or Lyon, around the year 170. Down the street, there is a Marcionite congregation. They call themselves Christians. They sing to Jesus. And they have something you do not have. A defined book. A clean, portable, teachable answer to the question, what is our scripture? Your congregation has a cloud of texts and customs. Theirs has a canon. The word itself comes from a Greek term for a measuring rod, a builder's straight edge. Marcion had built a straight edge, and every church that rejected him now had to explain, in public, where the true line actually ran. This is why many historians of the Bible, across a wide spectrum of views, treat Marcion as the great accelerator of the canon, a famous line of scholarship associated with the German historian Adolf von Harnack over a century ago, went so far as to call the Catholic New Testament a response to Marcion's. Most scholars today would soften that claim. Some, like the British scholar John Barton, have argued the mainstream church was already moving toward its collection and would have arrived there anyway. You should know that both positions exist, but even the cautious version concedes the point that matters tonight. Marcion changed the question. Before him, churches asked, is this book edifying? After him, they had to ask, is this book in? Notice the deep irony, because it will repeat. The first person in history to draw up a Christian canon was a man the church condemned as a heretic. The instrument that would eventually be used to exclude the Gospels in our desert jar was invented by the excluded. Orthodoxy did not think of the list. It inherited the list from its enemy, and spent 250 years correcting it. And the correction began almost immediately. If Marcion said one gospel, the churches had to answer a question they had never formally faced. Then how many? Somebody was going to have to stand up and defend a number, with arguments, in writing, and attach names to the books while he was at it. Within a generation, somebody did. He was a survivor of a massacre, with a long memory and a longer pen, and his favorite number was 4. Chapter 6. The Bishop Who Counted to 4. The summer of 177 was a terrible season to be a Christian in Gaul. In the city of Lugdunum, which we now call Lyon, in what is now France, a wave of mob violence turned into official persecution. Christians were dragged into the forum, interrogated, and tortured. Some died in prison. Others were sent into the amphitheater, where a slave woman named Blandina became famous across the Christian world for outlasting everything her tormentors invented. The whole story survives because the community wrote a long letter about it, preserved for us by the church historian Eusebius. Among the dead was the city's bishop, a man in his 90s named Pothinus. The man chosen to replace him was away in Rome when the killing happened, carrying a letter on church business. His name was Irenaeus. He came back to a congregation of survivors, took the seat of a murdered bishop, and then sat down to fight a different kind of battle. Not against Rome, against other Christians, because in the shaken churches of the Rhone Valley, teachers were circulating with new doctrines and new books, secret revelations, private interpretations. Many of them belonged to the school of Valentinus, the most fashionable Christian intellectual movement of the age. And Irenaeus had decided that this, not the amphitheater, was the threat that could actually kill the church. Before we open his famous book, meet the man for a moment, because his biography is one of his arguments. Irenaeus was not a native of Gaul. He had grown up in Asia Minor, in or near Smyrna. and as a boy he had listened to the city's bishop, Polycarp. In a letter quoted by Eusebius, Irenaeus tells a friend that he could still remember the very spot where Polycarp sat, the way he spoke, how he described his conversations with John and with others who had seen the Lord. Whatever one makes of the details, the claim itself is the point. Irenaeus believed he stood 2 handshakes from Jesus. Polycarp had heard the apostles. Irenaeus had heard Polycarp. In every argument to come, that chain of memory is his trump card. Truth, for Irenaeus, is not a secret you discover. It is an inheritance you can trace, name by name, back to the source. Around the year 180, he finished the work that made him the most important Christian writer of his century. Its full title is a mouthful: On the Detection and Overthrow of Knowledge, Falsely So Called. History shortened it to Against Heresies. 5 volumes. And here is a detail worth savoring. For most of 17 centuries, this attack was our main window into what the Gnostic teachers actually taught. Because their own books were gone, scholars could read the prosecutor but not the defendants. Then the jar came out of the ground at Nag Hammadi. The defendants finally spoke, and researchers discovered something genuinely surprising. Irenaeus had described their systems, aeon by aeon, more accurately than almost anyone had expected. Hostile, yes. Sneering, often, but not. On the whole, inventing. When he summarizes the myth of Sophia and the ignorant creator, you can now check him against the secret book of John. The outlines match. His counterattack ran on 2 rails. Both of them lead straight to Carthage. The first rail was public tradition against private revelation. The Gnostic teachers claimed a hidden channel. Secret teachings passed from Jesus to one disciple to a chosen few. Irenaeus answered with a simple, devastating question. Where were these secrets for 150 years? The churches founded by the apostles were public. Their teaching was public. Their leaders were known, and the succession of those leaders could be recited from memory. He does exactly that in Book 3, listing the bishops of Rome from the apostles down to his own day. 12 names in a row. If Jesus had left a secret key to everything, Irenaeus argues, the people he actually appointed would have known it. Scholars of our own time debate how idealized this picture of smooth succession really was. And historians like Bart Ehrman have argued the early landscape was far messier than Irenaeus admits. But as an argument, it landed. It planted the standard that would one day be called apostolicity. A true book must come from the apostles or their circle, through channels you can name. The second rail was the Gospels themselves. And here Irenaeus wrote the sentences this entire night has been walking toward. He is the first surviving author to state, plainly and by name, that the Church has exactly 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Not 3, not 5, not 1, 4. He calls them the fourfold gospel. One message in 4 witnesses. And to explain why 4, he reaches for an analogy that has made modern readers smile for centuries. There are 4 zones of the world, he writes, and 4 principal winds. The cherubim have 4 faces. Therefore it is fitting that the Church, spread across the whole earth, should rest on 4 pillars, breathing immortality from 4 directions. Let us be honest with each other. As promised, as a logical proof, the 4 winds argument proves nothing. You cannot derive a table of contents from a weather map. Critics have said so since antiquity, and they are right. But historians read the passage differently, and the difference matters. Irenaeus writes about the four not as a proposal but as a fact of nature, something so settled that it can be compared to the compass points. Many scholars conclude from this that he is not inventing the fourfold gospel in 180. He is defending a consensus that had already formed in the major churches during the previous decades. In the very years after Marcion published his list of one, some researchers push back and see Irenaeus as more of an innovator than he pretends. The debate is real and unfinished. Either way, after him, the number 4 is on the record, in writing, with names attached, and it never leaves. Just as important is what he says about the books outside the 4. He knows them. He names names. He reports that the followers of Valentinus possess a work called the Gospel of Truth, and he is unimpressed, remarking that it agrees in nothing with the Gospels of the Apostles. 16 centuries later, a Gospel of Truth rose out of the sand at Nag Hammadi, and scholars still discuss whether it is the very book he meant. He attacks a Gospel of Judas circulating among a sect he calls Canaanites, a title that meant almost nothing to the public until 2006, when a battered codex brought a Gospel of Judas back into the light, and his lonely reference suddenly had a body of evidence attached to it. Think about what that means for our story. The boundary was not drawn in silence. The man drawing it had read, or at least investigated, the books he was drawing it against. One more piece of his legacy. And then the road bends south. Against private interpretation, Irenaeus set up what he called the rule of faith, a short public summary of Christian belief. One God, maker of heaven and earth, one Christ, truly born, truly crucified, truly raised. Notice how every clause is a locked door against the mythology we met in chapter 3. The Creator is not a blind impostor. The world is not a mistake. The crucifixion is not an illusion. That little summary is the seed of the creeds. And it is also a measuring device. Hold a book against it. If the book teaches a different creator or a phantom Christ, the book fails. The technical name for that test, in the centuries ahead, will be orthodoxy, apostolic origin, agreement with the public rule of faith, a settled core of 4. By the year 200, the raw materials of a canon exist. What does not yet exist is the finished list. And the surviving evidence from the next century and a half shows the edges still moving. Books drifting in, books drifting out, churches disagreeing, politely and otherwise. So the question sharpens. Between Irenaeus and the council at Carthage stretched 200 years. What exactly were the tests a book had to pass in those 2 centuries? Who applied them? And how did they work when the case was hard? That is not a mystery either. The tests were written down, and to watch one of them being applied in real time. We are going to a small town on the coast of Syria, where a bishop is about to change his mind in public. Chapter 7. The 4 Tests. Picture a lamp-lit room in Antioch. Around the year 200, a man named Serapion, bishop of one of the greatest Christian cities in the world, is reading a book late into the night. The book is called The Gospel of Peter. He has met it before. On a visit to the small coastal town of Rossus, he found the congregation there reading it in worship, and when they asked his permission, he shrugged and gave it, a gospel under Peter's name, in a church that seemed at peace. Why not? Then reports followed him home. So now he is actually reading the thing, line by line. And somewhere in these pages his face changes. The text before him hints that Christ did not truly suffer on the cross. Serapion puts the book down, calls for pen and papyrus, and writes a letter to Rosses taking his permission back. The letter survives, quoted by the historian Eusebius, and it contains a sentence that could stand as the motto of this entire chapter. We receive Peter and the other apostles as Christ. He writes, but the writings that falsely bear their names we reject. As men of experience, read that carefully. The name on the cover was not enough. The content had to match the public teaching, or the name was judged a forgery. That is not a mob burning books. That is something closer to an editor checking a manuscript against a standard in writing, with his reasons attached. Tonight we are going to do something most videos on this subject never do. We are going to take the standards that men like Serapion were applying, all 4 of them, and run the books from the jar through them, one at a time. So you can watch the machine actually work. One honest caution first. No ancient committee ever printed a checklist with 4 boxes. The tests are the modern historian's summary of standards the ancient sources use again and again. Scholars of the canon, from Bruce Metzger of Princeton in the last century to writers like John Barton today, describe them in slightly different words. But the 4 keep appearing in Irenaeus, in Eusebius, in letters like the one Serapion just sealed. So here they are. Test 1. Apostolicity. Was the book written by an apostle or by someone in an apostle's circle? Notice how practical this test is. It is not mystical. It is a question about authorship and dating. The same questions a modern editor would ask. Mark was accepted because tradition, going back to a 2nd century source, Eusebius quotes, held that Mark wrote down the preaching of Peter. Luke was accepted as the companion of Paul, and the test had teeth even against books people liked. The Shepherd of Hermas, that popular Roman visionary text, was blocked in part on exactly these grounds. A document from around the year 200, called the Muratorian Fragment after the Italian scholar who found it in a Milan library in the 1700s, says the Shepherd was written recently, in our own times, and therefore may be read privately but not in church. Too new, wrong century, case closed. Now run the jar through test 1. The Gospel of Thomas claims the authority of the Apostle Thomas. The secret book of John claims John, and the churches simply did not believe the claims. Here, the modern scholar and the ancient bishop largely agree, which is worth pausing on. Mainstream scholarship dates most of the Nag Hammadi texts to the 2nd and 3rd centuries, generations after the apostles were dead. The bishops could not run laboratory tests, but they could do something almost as effective. They could ask their grandparents. A book that surfaces in the year 170, claiming to be by an apostle, in a church network where the apostles' actual students had known people still living, faced a memory problem. Irenaeus makes precisely this argument. The secret books were new, and everyone could see they were new. Test 2. Orthodoxy. Does the book agree with the rule of faith? The public summary of teaching handed down in the churches. This was the theological test, and Serapion's midnight letter is the perfect specimen of it in action. A book could carry an apostle's name and still fail. If its content taught what the churches did not, we will spend the entire next chapter inside this test. because it is where the Gnostic Gospels truly collided with the emerging church. The Creator, the body, the cross. For now, just hold the shape of it. The rule of faith was short enough to memorize, and public enough that any congregation could apply it. It was a measuring rod anyone could pick up. Test 3. Antiquity paired with continuous use. Had the book been read in the churches, publicly, since the early days? This test rewarded a paper trail. Paul's letters passed easily, because congregations had been reading them aloud since the 50s of the first century, and everyone knew it. The 4 Gospels passed because, by the mid-100s, Justin Martyr already describes them being read in Sunday worship alongside the prophets. Now flip the test around and aim it at the jar. The Gnostic texts, by their own proud account, were not read publicly since the beginning. They were secret. That was their entire sales pitch. Truth whispered, hand to hand, to the worthy few. What looked like a mark of prestige inside the movement became, at the door of the canon, a fatal admission. A secret tradition, by definition, has no public witnesses. The bishops treated an unverifiable pedigree the way any careful buyer treats an unverifiable pedigree. Test 4. Catholicity, which simply means universality. Was the book received across the whole network of churches, east and west, or only in one region or one school? This was the test of geography and consensus, and it explains most of the strange, slow edge cases of the canon. The letter to the Hebrews was loved in the East, but doubted in the West for generations, partly because nobody could prove who wrote it. The book of Revelation sailed through in the West and was doubted in the East, where Dionysius, a learned bishop of Alexandria in the 200s, analyzed its Greek style and argued it could not come from the same hand as the Gospel of John. His literary analysis still impresses modern scholars. These books eventually passed, but the debates around them prove the door was real, and that even beloved books were made to wait at it. The Gnostic Gospels, against this test, never had a chance. They circulated within schools. The followers of Valentinus, the Scythian circles, pockets in Egypt and Syria. There was no century in which the churches of Rome, Carthage, Antioch, and Gaul all read the Gospel of Philip on Sunday morning. Universality cannot be forged retroactively. 4 tests. Then, a named author with a traceable line. Agreement with public teaching. A long public reading history. Acceptance across the whole map. Now notice something about their design, because this is the insight most retellings miss. Every single test points in the same direction, away from secrecy and toward the public record. Apostolicity is a public chain of names. Orthodoxy is a public rule anyone could recite. Continuous use is a public reading list. Catholicity is a public consensus. The canon process, whatever else one thinks of it, was structurally biased toward books that had lived their whole lives in the open. The Gnostic Gospels were not excluded by a conspiracy operating in the dark. It was closer to the reverse. They were books from the dark, judged by a process that only trusted daylight. Is that the whole story? Honesty requires a final footnote. Power was real. Winners wrote the histories. And historians like Bart Ehrman rightly remind us that the side with more bishops and, after Constantine, more imperial favor, got to enforce its list. Some scholars argue the tests were applied unevenly. And the long wobbling over Hebrews and Revelation shows human judgment at work, not machinery. All true. And yet the tests themselves were stated in public, applied in writing, and can be read today. That is more than can be said for most decisions of the ancient world. But one of those 4 tests was carrying more weight than the others. When the bishops opened the secret books and read the actual sentences, what exactly did they find that made compromise impossible? The answer is specific. It has to do with who made the world, whether a body can be holy, and whether salvation was ever meant to be a secret. 4 collisions, written down by the men who felt them. We read them next. Chapter 8. The Collision. Carthage. Around the year 200, decades before the council in our title, in the same city, a lawyer is writing by lamplight. His name is Tertullian. He is the first great Christian author to work in Latin, and he writes the way a prosecutor cross-examines. In short, hard, sarcastic thrusts. Tonight he is answering the followers of a teacher who claims that Christ's body was not a real body. Tertullian dips his pen and produces a sentence that will be quoted for 18 centuries. If Christ's flesh was an illusion, he writes, then our salvation is an illusion too. Hold that sentence. It is the sound of the collision this chapter is about. Because when the bishops of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries opened the secret books and read the actual lines, they did not object to style. They objected to 4 specific teachings, and they wrote their objections down. This chapter is those 4 collisions, one at a time, in the order the ancient sources themselves keep returning to. Collision 1. Who made the world? Open almost any page of the Church Fathers against the Gnostic teachers, and this is the wound they press first. The secret book of John taught that the maker of this world was Yaldabaoth, a blind impostor, and that the true God stood far above him, untouched by matter. Against that, the emerging church planted a flag in the very first line of its scriptures. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. One God, the same God, the Father of Jesus and the maker of mud, stars, wheat, and human hands, with no impostor in between. Understand what was actually at stake, because it was not abstract. If the Creator is a fraud, then creation is a crime scene. Marriage, food, the body, the harvest, all of it belongs to the enemy. Irenaeus saw the consequence clearly and said so. A church that despises the world cannot bless it. His counterclaim was blunt. Matter is not a mistake. The hands that shaped Adam were the hands of the true God. And the world, however damaged, is a good thing gone wrong, not a bad thing built on purpose. Notice that this is not a small disagreement about emphasis. 2 religions can share a savior. They cannot share him for long if they disagree about whether existence itself is a gift or a trap. Collision 2. Did Christ actually have a body? We met Docetism in the chapter on the God above God, the teaching that the divine Christ only seemed to be flesh. We met it again in Serapian's midnight letter about the Gospel of Peter. Now hear why the objection carried so much weight. The churches were communities built around 2 physical claims: that God had truly been born, and that God had truly died. Their central weekly act was a meal, bread and wine, body and blood. Their boldest promise was resurrection, not as a metaphor, but as the raising of bodies, Tertullian's lamplight sentence simply follows the logic to its end. A phantom savior saves phantoms. The whole structure, birth, cross, tomb, meal, resurrection, stood or fell on the reality of one body, and there was a second edge to this blade, sharper and more human. By the time these debates hardened, the churches had martyrs: Blandina in the amphitheatre at Lyon, Polycarp at his pyre in Smyrna. Ordinary believers had accepted real deaths in real bodies rather than deny a crucified Lord. Some Gnostic texts, meanwhile, spoke of the true Christ standing above the cross, laughing at those who believed they could kill him. Elaine Pagels, in her famous study The Gnostic Gospels, argued that this issue divided the movements at the level of blood. A church of martyrs could not canonize a laughing, untouchable Christ without unsaying every grave it had dug. That framing is her scholarly interpretation, and you should weigh it as interpretation. But the underlying texts on both sides are real, and you can read them. Collision 3. Is salvation a secret? Here the two visions disagreed not about God, but about people. The books in the jar were addressed, by their own account, to the few. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. The worthy, the spiritual, several Valentinian texts, as reconstructed by scholars, sorted humanity into classes, with only some capable of full rescue. Knowledge saved, and knowledge, by nature, is unevenly distributed. The bishop's counterclaim was almost aggressively unglamorous. Salvation was announced in daylight, to anyone. Its entry requirements were faith and baptism, available to a dock worker, a slave, a child, a grandmother, none of whom needed to master a map of 30 eons. Irenaeus made the point with visible irritation. The apostles, he said, taught openly, to all, and reserved no private curriculum for the clever. Historians can fairly note that the public church had its own hierarchies and its own gatekeeping, and Bart Ehrman, among others, has documented how messy the reality was. But as a matter of stated principle, the collision is stark. One movement said the truth was a whisper. The other said it was an announcement. You cannot build one Bible for both. Collision 4. Who gets to check the teaching? This last one is less famous. In the judgment of many modern historians, it may have mattered most. A secret tradition has a structural feature. It cannot be audited. If a teacher claims a private revelation, handed down invisibly from one enlightened mind to another, there is no register anyone can consult. No congregation can stand up and say, "We were there. That is not what we received." Every new teacher can revise the secret, and several did, which is why the systems Irenaeus catalogued multiply and contradict each other. The public church was building the opposite machine, named bishops in named cities, in lines anyone could recite, a rule of faith short enough to memorize, scriptures read aloud, weekly, in front of witnesses. For generations, Pagels argued that this fight was therefore also a fight about authority, that in rejecting the secret books, the bishops were defending the office of bishop itself. Her critics have answered that the theology drove the politics rather than the reverse. That debate between historians remains open, and we will not settle it tonight. What is not debated is the shape of the choice. One side proposed truth as a private inheritance. The other proposed truth as a public record. The canon was the public record's final form. Now stand back and look at the four collisions together. A false creator against a good creation. A phantom Christ against a body that could die. A saved elite against an open door. A whisper against a register. Run your mind back over the four tests, and you will see the fit. The tests were not arbitrary. They were the door built to match exactly these dangers. As the churches understood them, whatever you believe about who was right, and that question belongs to you and not to this narrator. The historical point stands on documents you can read. The Gnostic Gospels were not excluded in a fit of absent-mindedness, and not by a lone villain in a marble hall. They were excluded because two incompatible accounts of God, the world, and the human body could not live between the same covers. By the year 300, the arguments were essentially complete. What did not yet exist was the final, numbered, official list. That required a century of a very different kind, an empire changing sides, a bishop who spent 17 years of his career in exile, and a letter, sent out one Easter from Alexandria, with 27 names in it. Chapter 9. The Easter Letter. The 4th century opened with Christians hiding their books from the police. It closed with Christians deciding, officially, which books had been worth hiding. Both halves of that sentence matter. Take them in order. In the year 303, the Emperor Diocletian launched the last and worst persecution the Roman Church would ever face. One of its first decrees was aimed not at people, but at paper. Scriptures were to be surrendered and burned. Church records from North Africa preserve the ugly aftermath, including lists of clergy who handed books over to the authorities. They were branded with a name that became a curse. Traditores, the handers over, the root of our word traitor. Here is why that police action belongs in the story of the canon. When a soldier is at your door demanding the sacred books, the question of which books are actually sacred stops being a seminar topic. Communities under book-burning pressure had to know what they were willing to die for, and what they could surrender without sin. Several historians of the canon have pointed out that persecution, in this way, acted as an accelerant. Nothing clarifies a library like a bonfire. Then, within a single lifetime, the world flipped upside down. In 312, Constantine won control of the Western Empire and attached his fortunes to the Christian God. Persecution ended. Churches were built at imperial expense, and in a detail that matters to us. Constantine wrote to the historian Eusebius, the same Eusebius we have been quoting all night, and ordered 50 magnificent copies of the sacred scriptures for the churches of his new capital. 50 deluxe Bibles, which forces a question the empire itself was now asking. Copies of what? Exactly. A production order requires a table of contents. Some scholars have wondered whether great surviving 4th century Bibles, like Codex Sinaiticus, could be connected to projects of this kind, though that identification remains speculation, and you should hear it as such. Eusebius himself, writing around this time, gives us a snapshot of the shelf, and the snapshot is honest about its own blurriness. He sorts the books into categories: the acknowledged, including the 4 Gospels, Acts, and the letters of Paul; the disputed, books like James, Jude, and 2 Peter, loved in some churches and doubted in others; and the rejected, the edges, in other words, were still soft in the 320s. Remember that, because in the popular imagination, This is exactly the period when the matter was supposedly settled in a single dramatic vote. You have probably heard that story, that in 325, at the Council of Nicaea, Constantine and the bishops chose the books of the Bible and banned the rest. Hold that story up to the light for one moment, and then set it aside, because in the next chapter we will take it apart properly. For now, one plain fact: the surviving records of Nicaea, its creed, its canon, its letters, contain no ruling on the list of Scripture. The council was consumed by a different fire entirely, a dispute about whether the Son was fully God, sparked by a priest named Arius. And it is precisely that dispute which brings our next protagonist onto the stage. Because, standing in the room at Nicaea, as a young assistant to the Bishop of Alexandria, was a small, intense, immovable man in his 20s whose entire career would be forged by that fight. His name was Athanasius. Within 3 years, he was Bishop of Alexandria, one of the most powerful seats in Christendom. He would hold that office for 45 years and spend 17 of them in exile. Count the exiles with me, because the number tells you the temperature of the century. 5 times he was driven from his city, under 4 different emperors. He hid at one point among the monks of the Egyptian desert. At another point, tradition says, in his father's tomb. He returned every time. His admirers coined a Latin phrase that survives to this day: Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. Why does a stubborn bishop of Alexandria matter to a knight about the Gnostic Gospels? Because of a piece of routine paperwork. Every year, it was the custom of the Bishop of Alexandria to send out a letter announcing the date of Easter to the churches of Egypt. And bishops used these festal letters to address whatever business the year demanded. In the year 367, Athanasius sat down to write his 39th festal letter. Somewhere in its pages, after the calendar business, he turned to a problem that had clearly been irritating him. Certain books, he wrote, were being passed around under famous names, and simple believers were being misled. And then he did something no one, in any surviving document, had ever done before. He listed, by name, 27 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the letters, Revelation, exactly the 27 that sit in every New Testament printed today. Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. He called them the books that are canonized, using a form of the Greek word canon, the measuring rod we met in the Marcion chapter. In these alone, he declared, the teaching of godliness is proclaimed. Let no one add to them, and let nothing be taken away. 367, not a council, not an emperor. A yearly Easter mailing from Alexandria. That is the first appearance in history of your exact New Testament. And the fact that it arrived as a bishop's circular rather than as an imperial decree tells you something true about how this process actually worked. Athanasius was not inventing a list out of nothing. He was drawing a hard line through a consensus that had been thickening for 2 centuries. And he had the authority, and frankly the temperament, to draw it without apologies. But the letter had a second edge. Athanasius did not only say which books were in. He turned, with characteristic heat, on the books that were out. The Apocrypha, calling them an invention of heretics. Written late, dressed up with false ages and famous names to deceive the simple. And he urged that such books be In effect, cleaned out. Now connect the dates, because this is where the whole night folds together. Athanasius sends that letter across Egypt in 367. The Nag Hammadi codices were bound. Judging by the dated scraps in their covers, sometime after the 340s, the jar was buried at the foot of a cliff, a short walk from a monastery of the Pachomian order, whose monks were loyal readers of Athanasius, and whose communities preserved his letters. Put those three facts side by side, and a hypothesis practically writes itself. Somewhere in the years after 367, monks under pressure to purge their library chose, instead of burning their beloved books, to seal them in a jar and hide them in the cliffs. You should know exactly what that claim is. It is a scholarly hypothesis, advanced by researchers associated with the publication of the library. It is attractive, widely repeated, and unproven. No ancient source records the burial. Some scholars in recent years have challenged the monastic connection entirely, suggesting the books may have belonged to private owners, and the debate remains genuinely open. What is fact is the convergence of dates, the location, and the letter. What is interpretation is the story that links them. Tonight, you have heard both, labeled as what they are. Either way, notice the strange shape of the moment. The same decade that gave the New Testament its final form may also have driven its rivals into the ground, where they would wait 16 centuries for a farmer's mattock. One thing was still missing: a list in a letter, even from Athanasius. Was one bishop's ruling. For the decision to harden into the common property of the whole church, it needed councils. Minute, signature. That paperwork was coming. At the end of the century, in a port city in North Africa, the city in our title, Chapter 10, Carthage, 397. We have finally arrived, so let us do this properly and honestly, because what happened at Carthage is both smaller and more interesting than the legend. First, the place, Carthage, on the coast of what is now Tunisia, was among the greatest cities of the Roman world, the capital of Roman Africa, a harbour town of grain ships, law courts, and famously argumentative Christians. North Africa had given the Church its first Latin Bible translations, its fiercest writer in Tertullian, and more martyrs than its cemeteries could politely hold. By the late 300s, the African churches ran their affairs through regular councils, synods of bishops meeting to settle discipline, review cases, and standardize practice. Keep that word in mind. Practice. These gatherings were less like constitutional conventions and more like professional review boards, working through agendas. On the 28th of August, in the year 397, one of those councils met at Carthage, presided over by Aurelius, the city's energetic bishop. Among the bishops in his circle at these African councils was a relatively new colleague from the inland town of Hippo Regius, a former professor of rhetoric who had converted late and risen fast. His name was Augustine. He would become the most influential Christian thinker of the next 1,000 years. His presence tells you the intellectual weight this council could draw on. Somewhere in the session, the bishops took up the reading list, and here is the actual substance of what they ruled, condensed faithfully. It was decided that nothing should be read in church under the name of divine scriptures except the canonical writings. And then the list: the 4 Gospels, Acts, the letters of Paul, the Catholic epistles, Revelation, 27 books of the New Testament. The same 27 Athanasius had named 30 years earlier. The same 27 on your shelf tonight. The ruling also listed the Old Testament. And for those keeping score, that list included books like Tobit and Wisdom, which Catholic and Protestant Bibles would famously part ways over 11 centuries later. Different night, different story. Now, 3 honest observations. This is the moment the entire internet gets wrong, and our whole night has been built to get it right. Observation 1. Carthage did not invent this list. It confirmed it. We know this from the council's own records, which refer back to a previous council at Hippo, in 393, where the same canon had already been approved. The 397 ruling is, in form, a ratification of existing African policy, and Hippo itself was not inventing anything either. It was writing down, as regional law, the consensus we have watched thicken across 2 centuries, from Irenaeus and his fourfold gospel, through the 4 tests, to the Easter letter of Athanasius. The scholar Bruce Metzger, in his standard history of the canon, made the point in a sentence worth carrying home. The councils did not create the canon. They recognized it. You can debate the theology of that formulation, and some historians would add that recognition backed by bishops and, eventually, imperial structures is its own kind of power. But as a description of the paperwork, it is simply accurate. Observation 2. This was a local council, not a global one. The bishops at Carthage spoke for Roman Africa. They did not speak for the whole church, and they knew it. Their own ruling says so. In a clause almost no one quotes, the canon list ends with a note that the church across the sea, meaning Rome and the wider communion, should be consulted for confirmation. Read that again. The council that the internet imagines as the Vatican imposing its Bible on the world was, in reality, a regional synod politely noting that its decision should be checked with everyone else. There was no Vatican in the modern sense to do the imposing. There was a network of churches, comparing lists, converging. Observation 3. And this is the one that reframes the entire question in our title. Look at what was actually still being debated at Carthage, and what was not. The books whose status the 4th century councils were genuinely settling were the edge cases we met earlier. Hebrews, with its unknown author, Revelation, doubted in the East. The little letters, 2 Peter, Jude, those were the open files on the desk. And the Gospel of Thomas, the secret book of John, the Gospel of Philip. They were not on the agenda, not as candidates, not as controversies, not even, as far as the surviving records show, as talking points. By 397, the books in our desert jar had been outside the walls for 2 centuries. The 4 tests had done that work generations earlier. In the age of Irenaeus and Serapion, Carthage did not throw the Gnostic Gospels out of the Bible. It locked a door they had stopped knocking on long before. So, when the question is asked, and it is the question this video promised to answer, what technical decision excluded the Gnostic texts? The honest answer has a precise shape. The exclusion was not one decision. It was a 2-stage process. Stage 1. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the 4 public tests: apostolic origin, orthodox content, continuous public use, universal reception, quietly filtered the secret books out of the church's reading lists. For the 4 theological reasons we heard in the collision chapter. Stage 2. In the 4th century, Hippo and Carthage converted that long filtration into formal, written, regional law, with a numbered list and a rule that nothing outside it be read in worship as scripture. The Gnostic Gospels were excluded, the way a candidate loses an election held over 200 years. Not the way a prisoner is condemned in one dramatic verdict, which brings us, unavoidably, to the dramatic verdict everyone thinks happened. The Council of Nicaea, 325, Constantine in the room, bishops, voting books in and out, 80 Gospels reduced to 4. If you have read a certain famous novel, you have absorbed some version of this scene. So let us hold it against the record, briefly and without mockery, because millions of intelligent people believe it, and they believe it because they were told it confidently. The surviving documents of Nicaea are not lost. We have its creed, its 20 canons, its synodal letter, and accounts from men who were there, including Eusebius. None of these documents contain a ruling on the canon of Scripture. Not a list, not a vote, not a debate about Gospels. The council was consumed by the Arian controversy, the question of the Son's divinity. Along with church discipline and the dating of Easter, the earliest known versions of the book voting story appear many centuries later. And the tale grew in the telling. Historians across the spectrum, from confessional scholars to skeptics like Bart Ehrman, agree on this with unusual unanimity. Whatever Nicaea did, it did not choose your Bible. The real story, as you now know, was slower, more scattered, and carried out largely by men whose names never made it into a thriller. An Easter letter, a synod at Hippo, a ratification at Carthage, with a humble clause about checking across the sea. Slower, scattered, and human. And yet, for the books left outside, the effect was just as final as any legend. After the councils, the copying stopped, and in the ancient world, a book that is not copied has begun to die. What that death looked like, and how close it came to being total, is where the road turns now. Chapter 11. The Vanishing. Books do not usually die by fire. They die by neglect. Fire is dramatic, and it happened. But the deadliest force in the ancient world was simpler and quieter. Papyrus rots. In most climates, a papyrus book had a working life measured in decades, perhaps a century or two with care. For a text to survive, someone had to copy it, by hand, again and again, generation after generation, forever. Copying was expensive. It required trained scribes, costly materials, and above all, a community that wanted the book enough to pay for its future. Which means the canon rulings of the 4th century were not merely a reading list, they were a survival list. A book read aloud in 1,000 churches every Sunday would be copied 1,000 times a century. A book, banned from the lectern, lost its economic reason to exist. Nobody needed to hunt down every copy of the Gospel of Philip. The councils had simply unplugged it from the machine that kept books alive. The empire, meanwhile, was adding pressure of its own. In the years after 380, the Emperor Theodosius issued a series of laws making Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman state. And the legal code that survives from the following decades reads, in places, like a demolition order aimed at religious minorities. Heretical assemblies were forbidden. Their buildings could be confiscated. Later, laws against various sects ordered their books sought out and burned. Historians rightly caution that Roman law was often more ferocious on parchment than in the streets, and enforcement varied wildly by province and by decade. But the direction of travel was unmistakable. Within living memory of Constantine's tolerance, the machinery of the state had swung around to face the very communities whose books filled our jar. So the communities faded. And here the record forces a moment of humility, because we know remarkably little about the end of the people themselves. The Valentinian school, once fashionable enough to alarm bishops from Gaul to Egypt, thins out of the sources across the 4th and 5th centuries. A law of Theodosius names Valentinians among proscribed groups. After that, scattered mentions, then silence. Whether the believers conformed on the surface, or simply raised children who drifted into the now official church, no chronicle bothered to say. Losers of ancient arguments rarely get obituaries. One partial exception survives to this day, and it deserves its footnote spoken aloud. In the marshlands of southern Iraq and southwestern Iran, a small community called the Mandaeans still practices a religion that scholars classify within the broad Gnostic family, with a divine world of light, a lesser creator, and John the Baptist honored as a great teacher. They are not descendants of the Nag Hammadi communities, and the connections are debated. But their existence is a reminder that this way of seeing the world was never entirely erased from the earth. Inside the former empire, though, the texts entered a strange half-life, and this is the great irony of tonight. For the next 14 centuries, the Gnostic Gospels survived almost exclusively inside the books written to destroy them. Think about what that means in practice. A medieval monk, copying Irenaeus in a monastery scriptorium, was unknowingly preserving summaries of the Sophia myth. A scholar reading Tertullian kept Marcion's arguments alive, in quotation. And the strangest case of all is a bishop named Epiphanius of Salamis, writing in the 370s, who compiled a massive catalogue of 80 heresies called the Panarion, a Greek word meaning medicine chest, because he offered it as a box of antidotes against the serpent bites of false teaching. Epiphanius was not a careful writer. Scholars handle his claims with tongs, because he mixed real information with rumor and open hostility, but he quoted extensively. Whole passages of otherwise lost Gnostic works exist today only because their angriest enemy could not resist reproducing them for refutation. The medicine chest became, against every intention of its maker, a museum. For centuries, that was the entire archive, the prosecution's files. If you were a European scholar in, say, 1700, and you wanted to know what the Gnostics believed, you read Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Epiphanius, and you took their word for it, because there was no other word to take. Then, slowly, the desert began to talk. The first whispers came in the 1700s, when 2 mysterious Coptic manuscripts surfaced through collectors and made their way to Britain. One, called the Askew Codex after the English doctor who bought it, contained a long, elaborate revelation text known as Pistis Sophia, in which the risen Jesus instructs his disciples for years, and Mary Magdalene asks most of the questions. The other, the Bruce Codex, bought in Egypt by a Scottish traveller named James Bruce, contained further Gnostic treatises. European scholars hardly knew what to do with them. They were strange, late, and unlike anything in the classical canon of church history. But they were primary sources, the first time the defendants had spoken in over a millennium. Then came the find we flagged in Chapter 2. In 1896, in Cairo, the German scholar Karl Reinhardt purchased a small papyrus book that became known as the Berlin Codex. Inside were several works, including the Gospel of Mary and a copy of the Secret Book of John. Publication was delayed for decades by a flood in a printing house, 2 world wars, and academic misfortune. A saga historians of scholarship tell with a certain black humor. But the point stands. Before Nag Hammadi, the texts were already beginning to seep back. And in the same years, at a site called Oxyrhynchus, British excavators digging through the garbage mounds of a Greco-Roman town pulled out papyrus scraps by the hundreds of thousands. Among them, published around the turn of the 20th century, were fragments of unknown sayings of Jesus in Greek. Scholars debated them for 50 years. Only after 1945 could anyone prove what they were. Pieces of the Gospel of Thomas, in its original language. Centuries older than the Coptic copy in the jar. The garbage dump had been holding evidence the whole time. Notice the pattern of this chapter, because it is the quiet thesis of the whole night. Nothing about this survival was planned. An enemy's medicine chest, a doctor's auction purchase, a flooded print shop, a town's ancient trash, and a jar under a cliff. The books that the councils unplugged did not survive because anyone in power relented. They survived because history is leaky, because deserts are dry, and because human beings, even hostile ones. I find it very hard to destroy words without repeating them. By the early 20th century, then, the world had fragments, rumors, and 2 or 3 battered codices. What it did not have was the library, the full shelf, in the movement's own voice, chosen by its own readers, that was still underground, sealed in the dark at the foot of Jabal al-Tarif, waiting out the last years of its 16th century silence. We opened this night with the man who broke that silence. Now we return to what he set loose. Chapter 12. What 1945 changed. A discovery is not an event. It is a process. And sometimes the process is slower than the burial. When the last codices from the jar were finally gathered into the Coptic Museum in Cairo, the hard part, strangely, began. The books existed. Almost nobody could read them. The pages needed conservation, photography, transcription from Coptic, translation, and publication. And every stage became tangled in the politics of the 20th century. Access to the manuscripts was restricted to small circles of scholars. The Suez Crisis, Révolution, and academic rivalries each added years. Scholars of that era later described the situation bluntly as a monopoly, with a handful of researchers controlling photographs that the rest of the world's experts were not allowed to see. The man who broke the jam was James Robinson, the Claremont scholar we met at the cliff, the same man who tracked down Muhammad Ali, the farmer. Working through UNESCO and an international committee from the late 1960s onward, Robinson pushed through a complete facsimile edition, photographs of every page, published for any library to buy. And in 1977, his team released the Nag Hammadi Library in English, the first complete translation in any modern language. 32 years after the mattock hit the jar, the public could finally read the books. Remember that gap the next time someone tells you the texts were suppressed in modern times. They were not suppressed. They were stuck in the ordinary, maddening, human way that projects get stuck. Then, a young professor made the jar famous. Her name was Elaine Pagels, and she had worked on the translation team. In 1979, she published a slim book called the Gnostic Gospels. It won the National Book Critics Circle Award for that year, took the National Book Award the following year, and became something no one expected. A bestseller about 4th century manuscripts, Pagels argued that the Gnostic controversy was never only about doctrine. It was about authority, who speaks for God, an institution with bishops and creeds, or the individual's direct inner experience. In her telling, the suppressed texts preserved a road not taken, and the canon was, among other things, the victory of one social structure over another. The applause was loud. The pushback was serious. Critics, including scholars with no confessional stake, answered that Pagels had romanticized the losers. The actual Gnostic texts, they pointed out, are often fiercely elitist, dividing humanity into spiritual classes. And their disgust with the body sits awkwardly with any modern egalitarian reading. The historian who calls the Gnostics ancient free spirits, these critics said, is looking into a well and seeing their own reflection. Both the thesis and the pushback are part of the scholarly record now. An honest documentary reports the argument, not just the applause, but the deepest fight the jar reopened had actually started before the jar was found. In 1934, a German scholar named Walter Bauer published a study with a quietly explosive claim. In many regions of the earliest Christian world, Bauer argued, the forms of faith later condemned as heresy were not late corruptions. They were, in some places, the original local Christianity. What we call orthodoxy was simply the version that won, and the winner then rewrote the story so that it had always been winning. For decades, Bauer's book was a specialist controversy, attacked for its thin evidence, defended for its daring. Then the Nag Hammadi library surfaced, and to many it looked like a crate of exhibits delivered to Bauer's courtroom. Here was the diversity, in the loser's own handwriting. The scholar who carried the argument to the general public is Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina, whose books describe early Christianity as a family of competing Christianities: Proto-Orthodox, Valentinian, Marcionite, each with its own texts, each convinced it held the true inheritance. In Ehrman's framing, the canon is the survivor's photo album, and against him stand serious opponents. Researchers like the late Larry Hurtado argued from the earliest layers of evidence that a recognizable core, one creator, God, a truly crucified and risen Jesus, was dominant far earlier and far more widely than the diversity thesis suggests. The fringes were real, they say, but they were always fringes. This is a live debate between careful people reading the same documents. It will not be settled by a video, including this one. What the jar changed is that the debate now happens with the defendant's own files on the table. Two smaller aftershocks deserve their minute. First, the Gospel of Thomas became a permanent fixture in historical Jesus research, because about half its sayings parallel the New Testament. Scholars gained a laboratory for asking how the words of Jesus were remembered, varied, and transmitted. A minority argue Thomas preserves, in places, older forms of sayings, A larger camp sees it as dependent on the earlier Gospels. Either way, a book excluded 16 centuries ago now sits on the required reading list of every serious seminary. Second, the desert was not finished. In 2006, the National Geographic Society announced the publication of the Codex Charcos, a battered 4th century book that had spent decades deteriorating in dealers' vaults and, at one point, a bank box on Long Island. Inside was the Gospel of Judas, the very text Irenaeus had sneered at 18 centuries earlier, the first translation presenting Judas as the hero entrusted with a secret mission, made global headlines. Then other scholars, led by specialists like April DeConnick, challenged key renderings, arguing the text actually casts Judas as a demon. The correction made smaller headlines, which tells you something about how this subject travels through modern media. First drafts, ancien and moderne, deserve suspicion. So tally what 1945 actually changed. Not the canon. No church added a 28th book, and none is going to. What changed is the mirror. Before the jar, Christian history looked like a single river with occasional flooding at the banks. After the jar, historians argue about how many streams there were at the source. And every argument must now cite texts that spent 16 centuries underground. The men at Hippo and Carthage settled their question. The jar reopened ours. One scene remains. Back to the cliff. One last time. To ask the only question tonight has not answered. Not what the books say. Not why they were excluded. But why someone, knowing all of it, chose sand instead of fire. Chapter 13. The one who chose the sand. Go back to the cliff one last time, but go back 16 centuries before the mattock. It is somewhere in the late 300s. The light is leaving the Nile Valley, and the limestone face of Jabal al-Tarif is turning the color of old bronze. A figure is climbing the lower slope, moving carefully, because he is carrying something heavy. A large jar, sealed, with a bowl fastened over its mouth. Inside it are 13 leather-bound books. We do not know his name. We do not know his face. Honestu, which has been the discipline of this entire night, requires saying plainly that we do not even know for certain that he existed as we are picturing him. The burial of the Nag Hammadi library left no record except the library itself. Everything about the person who carried the jar is reconstruction. But the jar was carried. Someone's hands sealed it. Someone's feet knew this slope, and the choices frozen inside that act can still be read. The way a detective reads a room. So read them. Choice 1. The books were not burned. Burning was the obvious solution, and by the logic of the age, the approved one. Athanasius had told the churches of Egypt, in the Easter letter of 367, that the Apocrypha were an invention of heretics. The empire's laws were moving the same direction. A fire takes one evening, costs nothing, and leaves no evidence to incriminate the owner. Whoever held these books chose, instead, the labor of a jar, a climb, and a grave in the rock. You do not go to that much trouble for books you despise. The most economical explanation, and the one many scholars have drawn, is that the burier loved them. Choice 2. The books were hidden, not displayed. Whoever it was did not stand in the church door and argue. They did not copy the texts and pass them on. which is how convictions usually fight for their future. They put the books where no one would find them, which is what you do when the argument is over and you know your side has lost it. If the hypothesis we weighed earlier is correct, if these were monks of the Pachomian houses nearby responding to the purge of their libraries, then the jar is the fingerprint of an impossible position. Ordered to destroy what they had spent their lives copying, they found a third way between obedience and defiance. The desert would hold what they could not keep and could not kill. That reconstruction remains a scholarly hypothesis, not a fact, and you have heard the objections to it. But few explanations account as gracefully for the tenderness of the burial. Choice 3. And this is the one that decides how the whole story feels. The jar was sealed well, sealed to last, whether the burier expected retrieval in a season, or in a generation, or never. The workmanship said the same thing. These words should outlive this moment. And they did. By roughly 1600 years, which may be the longest successful act of stubbornness in the history of reading, now hold that unnamed figure in one eye, and hold the rest of the night in the other, because the two views together answer the question our title asked. Why did the Church say no? You now know the answer has a precise, two-stage shape. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, 4 public tests: apostolic origin, agreement with the open rule of faith, continuous reading in worship, and acceptance across the whole map of churches. Filtered the secret Gospels out of Christian reading lists. The reasons were specific, and they were written down. A Creator who was not a fraud, a Christ who truly bled, a salvation announced to anyone rather than whispered to the few, a teaching that could be checked in public rather than trusted in private. Then, at the end of the 4th century, the councils at Hippo in 393 and Carthage in 397 converted that long verdict into written law for the churches of Africa. A numbered list of 27 books, a rule that nothing else be read in worship as scripture, and a clause, still preserved, about confirming the decision with the church across the sea. No emperor voted. Nicaea never touched the question. The Gnostic Gospels were not on the agenda at Carthage, because the tests had settled their case 2 centuries before the ink of that council was mixed. That is the record, and the record leaves each listener exactly one question that no council can settle for them, which is what to make of it. Some of you will hear this story as the slow, sane work of a community protecting a public inheritance from invented pedigrees and phantom saviors. Some of you will hear it as the victory of an institution over an inward path, with bishops choosing which doors to history got locked. Elaine Pagels and her critics have argued that question for almost 50 years, and both sides, as you have heard, hold documents in their hands. This documentary has given you the documents. The verdict was never its to deliver. But before the night ends, notice one last symmetry, because it has been hiding in plain sight since the opening scene. 2 groups of people preserved these books. The first were enemies: Irenaeus, Tertullian, Epiphanius. Men who quoted the texts in order to kill them, and thereby carried fragments of them alive through 14 centuries. Like insects in amber made of anger. The second was, if the leading hypothesis is right, a handful of friends, monks or readers who broke no rule loudly, who simply declined to light the fire, and trusted the driest ground on earth to be patient. Neither group intended what actually happened. The enemies meant refutation and achieved preservation. The friends meant preservation and achieved a 16th century silence. History used both. Indifferently. To carry the words to a farmer's mattock in December of 1945, there is something almost restful in that. If you let it settle. No single hand steered this story. Not Marcion with his scissors, not Irenaeus with his four winds, not Athanasius with his Easter letter, not the bishops at Carthage with their careful clause about the church across the sea, not the unnamed climber with the jar. Each one acted inside a single lifetime, doing what the moment seemed to demand. The shape only appears from where you are lying tonight, centuries downstream, with the whole map visible at once. The books are out of the ground now. They sit in a climate-controlled room in Old Cairo, and in translations on ordinary shelves, including, perhaps, one near you. The canon they were excluded from is unchanged. 27 books, exactly as the Easter letter named them. The argument about what it all meant has moved from council halls to seminar rooms, where it is conducted with footnotes instead of anathemas. Most would call that progress, and the jar itself is gone, broken on a December morning by a man looking for fertilizer, its fragments scattered at the foot of the cliff, its work complete. It had one task, given to it by hands we cannot name. In a century of purges, hold these words until the argument can be heard again. It held them. The argument is being heard again. You were part of it tonight, and it will still be here. Patient as the desert, when you wake,